Representative Gates and members of the House attending today, Dr. Gosar, at this field hearing, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Let me make 7 quick points. First, one of the original sins of government that has carried and caused the poor treatment of the January 6th protester defendants is the lawless formation of the House Select Committee, the January 6th Committee, leading to it acting in a one-sided and due process-free way. That committee was gerrymandered by Speaker Pelosi, operated without a ranking member or counsel to the ranking member. Liz Cheney was granted vice chair status to try to cover that up. The committee then had a series of carefully scripted by Hollywood hearings where the entire Q&A path was pre-written and meshed with cherry-picked snippets of highly edited video and audio doctored video. The committee interviewed 1,000+ witnesses, it says, but only about 200 transcripts have been released. Second, the January 6th committee worked with regime media, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and MSNBC, etc. In that way, the fake narrative that an insurrection had occurred on January 6th was blasted everywhere. Based on secretly recorded video, we now have on tape Nancy Pelosi's documentarian daughter and her friends admitting that no real insurrection ever occurred. The collective effect of the January 6th committee's shameful way of proceeding, plus the reinforcing media blitz, poisoned the jury pool in Washington, D.C. Trial venue transfers out of D.C. should have been permitted. Media narrative mongering, was also the pre-original sin, therefore, of this entire issue because it laid the groundwork for the January 6th Select Committee's hatchet jobs. Third, many of the defendants were swept up in a vast dragnet that I believe violated the Fourth Amendment because it was the equivalent of a general warrant that our framers sought to ban. This was done through the use of geofencing technology and cell phone data warrants sent to telecom providers. Additionally, many protesters arriving after President Trump's speech in the ellipse had finished did not see any signage that areas normally open to the public were closed that day, setting up a trespass trap for the unwary. Fourth, the Justice Department did not treat these cases with appropriate respect for the First Amendment rights of the protesters. The 2020 presidential election was incredibly contentious, and many citizens in this country disagreed with mainstream media pronouncements that they should, in essence, sit down and shut up about the election and how it was conducted. By contrast, I was at the Justice Department getting daily updates about the Marco Hatfield Federal Courthouse in Portland being attacked night after night after night in the summer of 2020. Insurrection is a far more appropriate moniker for that targeted Antifa lawlessness than a largely spontaneously assembled crowd being agitated by tear gas and rubber bullets. Yet the First Amendment issues led to the self-agitators in Portland being treated very differently and with special kid gloves. This takes me to my 5th point. The January 6th defendants have not been dealt with in the same fashion as the Antifa and BLM protesters in 2020 who engaged in terrible conduct, threatened the White House, did millions of damage in property in that summer, in the lead up to the presidential election. This is a flat violation in terms of comparing those two categories of defendants or potential defendants of the equal protection of the laws. Many Americans think the selective prosecution on display here is blatant. 6th, there are widespread Brady violations as to how these defendants are being dealt with today, and I'll confine that to just 2 areas for our purposes today. First, the concealed or underreported footage issue around the Capitol. So the House is to be commended for allowing Tucker Carlson, Julie Kelly, and John Solomon to review the footage. And second, it's hard to imagine that with 800+ or so unreleased January 6th committee deposition transcripts, that there's not at least some exculpatory evidence in there that has not yet been seen by the relevant defendants and their lawyers. The January 6th committee, in short, acted like a star chamber, and there is no reason for this Congress to let that go on. 7th and lastly, the judges on the federal district court here in Washington, D.C. seem to have come under the spell of the January 6th committee's original sin, and in that way they allowed the constructed mainstream media narrative to influence their decisions. And as a legal matter, they're by and large allowing a statute designed to close an obstruction of justice loophole that Arthur Anderson exploited in the Enron debacle to be applied to entirely different activity that in many instances is protected by the First Amendment and should appropriately be treated differently. As a result, Antifa and BLM revolutionaries, and it's not an exaggeration to call them that, who engaged in worse conduct largely got off scot-free, and worse yet, many of them left with bags of cash from civil settlements. By contrast, the sentences being handed down against January 6 defendants are wildly disproportionate. For all these reasons, I'm glad to be here today before you.
Thank you, Mr.